Hi everyone, my name is Ronnie Lee, and my group members are Madison, Angelina, and Kayla. And this week we put a presentation together for you guys of slavery and abolitionism in the 1850s. So today we're going to talk about the slaveholders, slaves, the northern workers, and the industrialists, and their view on freedom and slavery. So the slaveholders, what they originally thought was that slavery was necessary because African Americans were incapable of being free. They thought that Africans were similar to children and that they must be fed and protected by their slaveholder, that that was their right. They thought that they were like unlike children, they could never grow into be full adults and they could never be fully free. And industry work was seen as less degrading than agricultural work. Agricultural work was tough and you had to be strong and able bodied to work it. So it really was not degrading for them to be working in the fields. It was why they were working in the fields that was degrading. People argued that slavery was to everyone's benefit. The northern people are free to do whatever they want and to whoever they wanted and if they had the money. So in the north, the workers had, lesser rights than, those that were their factory, those that own the factories. So they worked in lesser conditions. The slaveholders would feed and house their slaves and they would give them, roughly 9 hours. I mean, hard work days, but they were 9 hour work days. Those in the north, when they would work, they would not get fed. They would have worked in really tough conditions with really long work hours, and they were treated terribly by their bosses. The slaveholders viewed themselves as nobles, meaning that they were the only ones they sought as truly free. That anyone that had a job or worked, they were not truly free because there was someone above them. There was a boss, an owner, someone that would be telling them what to do. They did not believe that slaves were created equal, and they didn't think they should be free since they were not equal to them. They shouldn't be free. They were racist and they were willing to profit from slave labor. Slaveholders were allowed to own property, and since they owned property, they did have the right to vote. They could move freely, and they were allowed to read and write. The slaves' view on freedom and slavery, they were clearly pro-abolition, and they wanted to put an end to slavery. They wanted to be seen as people and not as slaves or as lower humans. They also sought for freedom from the oppression by their slaveholders. Their idea of freedom was to be able to choose the job they wanted, live where they wanted, be able to have a family without fear of their children or family members being sold into slavery to different slaveholders. They didn't want to be servants any longer to the slaveholders. They wanted to be their own people. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was part of the Compromise of 1850. This required that the U.S. government assist slave owners in capturing their runaway slaves. So slaves that had somehow managed to run away and be free, probably get away to the north, they were now under the thumb of the U.S. government trying to find them and bring them back to their slaveholders. And if a slave was caught, or a so-called slave, they were not allowed a right to a jury trial. They would just be sent back to their slaveholders. This was really scary for those slaves that had fled and made it to the north, where they, thought they would be free because slavery was not practiced in the north. They no longer felt safe in the north, and they felt they had to flee even further. So they would go to Canada, and this is how Canada gained its first portion of African Americans as its population, or where they originally, started coming from. They just felt safe no longer in America, and they needed to get out of this country so that they could be free. Slaves were not allowed to own property. They couldn't vote. They were not allowed to move freely until they were in the North. But once they got to the North, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 kind of changed that. And they were not allowed to read or write. So the Northern workers' view of the word freedom. They didn't like the institution of slavery. They didn't like the idea of it, but they weren't completely for its abolition. They felt that if the slaves were set free, then they would all move north and take over their jobs. The Northern workers were not allowed to own property. And since they weren't likely to own property, since they didn't have the money, they were not allowed to vote. They were allowed to move freely. but they were not allowed to learn to read or write. The northern workers were the slaves of the North. They were the white slaves of the North, and they worked in really tough conditions and everything. For they were not fed, they weren't housed. They had to take the money that they were paid by the industrialists or the factory owners, and that is how they made their living. So you could imagine that it was tougher to be a northern worker, um, just based on your working conditions and things like that. The industrialists were those that owned the factories. They were basically the slaveholders of the North. They treated their workers with little respect, and they didn't feel obliged to feed their workers the same way that slaveholders felt they needed to protect and take care of their slaves. They did not agree with slavery based on race. They felt that slavery was not okay, but they kind of practiced their own form of slavery based on like class and wealth level. They did not treat their workers as equals to them at all. They didn't give them the same freedoms that they had. Industrialists were allowed to own property, and since they owned property, they were allowed to vote. They were allowed to move about freely, and they were allowed to read and write. So, freedom in the 1850s was not much different from the pre abolition era of freedom, when originally freedom was just, it didn't mean free from rule at all. It wasn't like you just got to do whatever you want, but it was more of like a collection of like civil rights and liberties that people had. And as America grew from colonies to a country, it still continued to mean the same thing. It was things like freedom of religion, the freedom to choose your own job, to live where you wanted, and then the right to a self government. The difference from pre abolition to the abolition era in the 1850s was about who was able to receive those freedoms. It wasn't for people to not believe at the time that it was for everyone. They felt that it was for just a select few, which at the time was white landowning males had all the freedoms. And during the abolition era, it became clear that, it was more of an equality idea, and that whites, African Americans, and women would all be equal at some point and have the same freedoms. And it should have been just equality as a natural right, regardless of race in the 1850s. And this was something that the North and South did not really agree on originally. And then after the Civil War is when freedom finally kind of began to mean the same thing for both of the groups. There was a book called Roll Jordan Roll and The World the Slaves Made. It was by Eugene D. Genovese in 1974. And this took a little bit of a different view on the life and culture of slaves. It didn't focus so much on the bad part of it, on what they had to go through, on the sad stories of it. It focused on their culture and the lives that they made for themselves while they were enslaved. And it was how they made their slaveholders see them as more than just slaves, how they wanted them to see them as humans and as people. And so it was just the way they did this, the way they were able to hold on to their own self-respect during the times of oppression, and they were able to keep pushing towards and seeing that light of their own freedom eventually. There's some accounts of their religion, their wedding, their foods, their language, the clothes, and the overall culture of the slaves in the 1850s. It's a true story of resilience to push through the oppression and to find a way to impact American culture as a whole later on. Thank you guys.